Welcome to the Silicon Web Costumers Guild Presents webinar, My Costume Myself, Celebrating Stories of Cosplay and Beyond with Dr. Thomas Endres from the University of Northern Colorado. The Silicon Web Costumers Guild Presents webinar series offers talks by speakers on a variety of topics about costumes and costuming. The webinars are free to Silicon Web members, and they may also be free to the greater costuming community on a space available basis. If you have suggestions or feedback on the webinars for future topics, please send them to board@siwcostumers.org, and please include the subject line webinar series. We'll appreciate your suggestions. The chapter wants to acknowledge the International Costumers Guild Mardi Gear Costuming Arts and Sciences Fund for a grant award in support of developing this webinar series. And we also like to acknowledge the International Costumers Guild for making its Zoom platform available to chapters and special interest groups. A note on Zoom, please set or leave your video and audio controls on mute. Feel free to chat or react during the presentation in the chat window. There will be a Q&A period after the presentation. If you want to ask a question, type it into the chat window and optionally label it as Q&A, and we'll get to your questions at the end of the webinar. When the webinar is over, you'll see a brief survey on your experience. We'd appreciate it if you could please fill out that survey. We use it to help improve our future webinars. Communications scholar Dr. Thomas Endres studies stories people share, their heroes, villains, settings that form a sense of community and inclusion. His recent book, My Costume Myself, Celebrating Stories of Cosplay and Beyond, examines the power of story in costumes people wear as a way of self-expression, representation, and identity. In this presentation, Dr. Endres will highlight the focus of each chapter of his book, including 3 costume conversations, which are in-depth interviews and photos of individuals and couples who express themselves via costuming. Take careful notes, because after he shares his brief snippets of these conversations, attendees will have an opportunity to select several that they'd like to explore in more depth. And you'll see a poll at the end where you could select 3 of the ones that you'd most like to see, and we'll take a consensus from the audience as to which ones that we'll do. Thomas Endres is the professor of communications and chair of the School of Communications at University of Northern Colorado, where he also teaches courses on unpacking popular culture. He's also a cosplayer who started going to Comic-Cons with his adult daughters and was impressed with the inclusive community. A small project to look at cosplayers at Fan Expo Denver quickly evolved into a 2-year project that led to a book. My Costume Myself, Celebrating Stories of Cosplay and Beyond, was a silver medalist for the Midwestern Independent Publishers Association Midwest Book Awards. And congratulations to that, Tom. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you, Philip, for that introduction. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book. I'm going to kick it off with a quotation from psychologist Andrea Letamendi, who said, "What if I told you that persons who cosplay actually feel more like themselves when they are in costume? What if looking like someone else makes them feel like who they really are?" And she concludes, "And what if that process is a completely normal one?" Now, it's probably no surprise that I agree with these statements by Letamendi. I may agree with it for different reasons than you, the viewing audience, do. I imagine that a lot of you who are watching this are more professional costumers, and that's not me. I'm not an expert on costumes. I'm not a costumer at all. I am a communication scholar. And as Philip mentioned, I study stories. So I buy into what Letamendi is saying because I really believe in the power of symbols and the power of nonverbal cues, and the belief that our stories really help define who we are. Now, that said, granted, I'm a bit of an amateur in the costume realm. You might not realize this, for example, but I am Batman. And I'm also Santa Claus. And depending upon my mood, I'm also a pirate or a biker or the Phantom of the Opera, or most recently, Ego, the Living Planet from Guardians of the Galaxy 2. As you know, we can basically be whatever costume or mask we decide to put on. And with that mask or costume goes an associated set of feelings, ranging from anonymity to empowerment. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next hour or so here. But let me begin with a quick preview of what's to come. I'll start by sharing an overview of this project, including a brief history and backstory of the book. And then we will take a walk through the book's outline, chapter by chapter, where I'll try to share some insights on cosplay, costumes in general. During that tour, you're going to briefly meet some of the interviewees. You heard Philip talk about the costume conversations. I'll discuss that a little bit more very soon here. But these are the more in-depth stories that I share at the end of each chapter. And then finally, I'll end with some conclusions, some suggestions for anybody that's thinking about doing similar projects or investigations. Right. On to the backstory. This book essentially is my magnum opus. I'm nearing retirement, so for me, this is the final project capping off more than 4 decades of studying rhetorical communities. That is, communities that are bonded not by geographic locale, but rather by a shared set of storylines, heroes, villains, backdrops, settings, and the like. So essentially, I study stories. I've examined the shared narratives of such diverse groups as bikers, father-daughter dyads, the Knights of Columbus, toy collectors, Catholic laity volunteers, people with tattoos, and it's different, tattooed people, comparing and contrasting those two communities. So in the spring of 2022 at my university, I had a sabbatical waiting for me. So I knew I would be doing a study of stories, but what new community did I want to investigate? Well, I've always tried to create a bit of a seamless integration between my professional work and my personal life. And in my real life, I had started to attend Comic Cons with my adult daughters and their husbands. And what impressed me the most was the wide range of attendees. I mean, all ages and sizes and shapes and colors. And I was particularly impressed that teens who might otherwise be bullied for their interests, for their orientations, for their level of ability or disability, everybody seemed to be having a great time. So this community was just what I was looking for. At that time, I reached out to the publisher Kirk House, who had previously published my book on the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally. And they signed me to a contract based on my letter of inquiry, which for those of you who've been down this road, you know what a victory that is. I began this project with the end result already in mind. So again, the sabbatical was scheduled for spring of 2022. Even before that, in 2021, my wife and I launched a year-long journey on the road where we started doing this investigation. Using social media and personal networks and Google searches of comic and anime con locations, we scheduled dozens of interviews and photo shoots around the country. Obviously, we live in Colorado, so a lot of what we did was here in sort of the mid to southwest portion of the United States. On the road, we started out by interviewing a couple in Florida. We flew to New York. From there, took a train to Chicago. Later on, we drove through the upper Midwest, the Badlands and the Black Hills of the Dakotas. A trip along the California coast followed, and then a journey to the New Orleans territory. And it was all capped off by a trip to Japan in the fall of 2022. As you look at this map, and obviously it's a heavy US Western focus. However, in my literature review, I encountered numerous studies done in Japan, Hong Kong, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, and Taiwan, in addition to studies from Greece, the Czech Republic, and Australia. As such, the book concludes with a separate appendix looking at international research, some of which I'll touch upon later in my talk. Philip mentioned at the beginning, originally, this was just supposed to be a small investigation during that spring of 2022 into cosplay at a local comic convention. That was it. However, it took on a life of its own. Everybody I talked to said, hey, have you considered this? Have you talked to so-and-so? And it just grew, moving past cosplay and into a study of costumes in many forms and contexts, including drag, celebrity impersonation, historical reenactments, even singing telegrams. And so that expanded perspective is present in the title of my book, My Costume Myself, Celebrating Stories of Cosplay and Beyond. And that, of course, influenced then the structure for the book, which is divided into two halves, cosplay and beyond. Now, each section is comprised of 3 chapters apiece, and each chapter concludes with 3 of these costume conversations that you've heard about. And so what we plan to do here is I'm going to walk through everything chapter by chapter, and at the end of each chapter, I will briefly let you know about the costume conversations that conclude that particular chapter. Now, in the book, each costume conversation is 6, 8, 10 pages long, and I'm going to boil it down to just a couple of sentences for you. What I've also done is I've boiled down each story into just a 1-page summary, kind of a highlight of that individual or couple. And with your poll, we're going to be able to take your votes throughout. You can pick the stories that you would like to hear in greater detail. And then sort of the top vote getters will be the ones that I will unpack by telling you those 1-page stories. Now, going back to the structure, as I mentioned, the book concludes with an appendix looking at international research. With that structure in mind, as promised, we're going to take a quick chapter by chapter tour of the book. In chapter 1, I'm going to spend a little bit more time here because I need to establish some foundational definitions and information, and the subsequent chapters will be more of a higher level kind of summary. Well, the first thing as a scholar that I needed for this was an operational definition of what I meant by costume. Now, it might be different than what you use in your association here, but I needed something to function as the sort of baseline for the book. So I sought out definitions from literally hundreds of outside resources. I was really influenced by Professor Pravina Chukla's argument that costume is set apart from regular dress. It is not meant to be ordinary, she states, but rather evocative, urging the daily further along an artistic trajectory that leads to heightened communication and often culminates in a spectacle for public consumption. Now, most persuasive to me was French and Reddy Best's statement that the use of costume is intentional, as it indicates clothing worn with an intended meaning in a particular context that is typically outside of everyday roles or activities that often takes the wearer through a transformational experience via mythical places or emotional depths. So from those definitions and the dozens and dozens of others that I encountered, I developed the following operational definition for my book: that costume is a conscious decision about clothing, recognizable as outside of the norm, intended to communicate an implicit or explicit message about self in either a general or a specific public context, right? You know that it's different, you do it on purpose, and whether or not it be at a convention, at a festival, at a concert, or just on the street, it sends a message about you. As such, my entire book argues that costume does more to reveal than it does to conceal. It's often an extension of who we are, an exploration of facets of our life and our personality that otherwise might not see the light of day. Now, chapter 1 also provides some tidbits from history. Now, if you're interested in cosplay history, and I know he's a member of this group and has done a presentation for you, Andrew Liptak's book on cosplay is really the best I have encountered when it comes to understanding costume and cosplay history. Lots of great details. He has some wonderful photos. I don't know where he got them from. But his book and a lot of the other historical books all tend to go back and say that the public at large started to become aware of costume events in the early 1900s when newspapers published pictures of Forrest J. Ackerman and Myrtle R. Douglas dressed as science fiction characters. What's interesting is that these different sources don't really agree on who Forrest and Myrtle were. Some say they are father-daughter, some say boyfriend-girlfriend, some say husband-wife. I believe Liptak says that at the time they became popular, they were boyfriend-girlfriend, but that the relationship probably did not continue to exist. Whatever the case may be, there is one thing upon which all cosplay historians agree. They agree that in 1984, a Japanese manga magazine writer named Nobuyuki Takahashi first introduced the world to the word cosplay. He attended the Science Fiction Worldcon in Los Angeles and was impressed by all the attendees dressed as characters from Star Trek and Star Wars and the like. And returning home, he lacked a word to describe what he'd seen. Now, sources suggest that at that time, he created this word, but in reality, he'd actually used and published that word a year before in a 1983 article that he'd written about Japanese college manga clubs. And he condensed two words of portmanteau, and he took the English words costume and play and coined for him cosplay or cosplay. And that was tucked away in that past article. Now, when he got home from WorldCom, needed a word, he went back, resurrected the term from that previous article, applied it here, and that's when it caught fire. That's when the word cosplay exploded and a new world was born. Now, fortunately, when I was in Japan in 2022, I had the opportunity to meet Takahashi-san, and here's a picture with the original 1983 My Anime magazine and where the word eventually came to be. Incidentally, Takahashi ended up loving this project, and he graciously wrote the foreword to the book. Continuing on with chapter 1, now that we have a word to use, I'll take just a moment to reiterate cosplay's powerful transformative effect on individuals. Crawford and Hancock conclude that cosplay is less about escapism for the wearer, but more as a way of exploring aspects of what they saw as their existing identity. Yamamoto calls this an act of searching, or a reflection that enacts a self-identification of what I am becoming. And Klein equates it with role-play therapy, noting that it can help with social anxiety, PTSD, and overcoming phobias. Now, in addition to evoking personality characteristics such as confidence and sociability, cosplay can also unlock feelings of altruism. Hence, chapter 1 concludes with a section looking at cosplay as charity, such as cosplay for a cause. All right, now remember, as we've been saying, each chapter concludes with 3 costume conversations, extended interviews from individuals around the country. And again, listen to these little brief snippets I give. If there are ones that you want me to unpack in greater detail at the end, just vote for them in that poll and we'll go for the top vote getters. At the end of this chapter, we first meet Eric. Met Eric at Big Apple Comic-Con in New York City, a cook and a tattoo artist from Brooklyn. He's dressed, obviously, as Gene Simmons from the 80s rock group Kiss. And this, he says, is the connection to his father that he and his dad connect through Kiss music. Next is Kat, pictured here with her husband, Lee. They are members of the Star Trek International Fan Association chapter called the USS Tiburon. Kat suffers from extreme social anxiety. Even grocery shopping causes her to panic. But when she puts on her Star Trek uniform, she feels like she has her shields up. And the final costume conversation in chapter 1 is with Casey, better known as Hospital Batman. Casey's the father of 3, a 16-year-old high-functioning autistic son, a 10-year-old daughter with a genetic disorder that leaves her functioning like a 1-month-old for whom he is primary caretaker, and a son with a similar condition who sadly passed away in 2010. Having spent a great deal of time in hospitals with his children, he remembers the relief he felt when they were entertained by costume characters, and his persona as Hospital Batman is his way of giving back. All right, from there, we're going to move on to chapter 2, where I cover rules for cosplay at conventions, at attendance, guidance for photography, how to do tribute performance, that kind of thing. Then follows a discussion of genres from A to Z, that is anime through zombies, looking at a variety of genres, including discussions about groups such as Lolitas, fancies, and furries. Next comes the debate on how accurate the costume needs to be. On this topic, most cosplay experts agree that there's no good or bad, only growth. And all topics address what Wing calls cosplay's potential for empowerment, agency, and self-determination through the character. Toward the ends of the chapter, I try to provide some insight on couples costumes. For example, Kelsey and David here dressed as Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor, and also on the opportunity to scale it back and participate in Cosplay Light. Again, Kelsey and David, this time adorned only in Superman t-shirts, but having an equally wonderful and welcome time at a con. The costume conversations for Chapter 2 kick off with Brianna and Ken, who reenacted for us their Lord of the Rings wedding. Now, they met online, and jokingly, she invited him to come make cookies for her aunt's funeral. Now, she was kidding, but a friend used her phone and texted in the address. Ken showed up at the door wearing a Sailor Moon belt with a lightsaber on his hip, and she looked at him and thought, he's the one. All right, we also met steampunk couple Vonet and Chase, known to their fictional cohort as Lady Vo and Chaos. She is the captain of the airship Iron Opal, and he is the ship's mechanical engineer. That's the fantasy community that they have created, which intermingles STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, with positive aspects of the Victorian era. In real life, their last name is Stilson. On the airship Iron Opal, they are the family Crossfire. And then we meet Elaine, a Filipino Art Center director, professional artist, and mother to Ember, a teen who identifies as non-binary. So in one of those small world kind of stories, I noticed that Elaine also had published an article in your chapter's issue of the Virtual Costumer, February of 2024. She published an article on an activity she does called Slay the Runway, held for LGBTQIA+ teens. Now here in this picture, mother and child are dressed as characters from the TV series Our Flag Means Death. Elaine selected this show because one of the characters, a pirate named Jim, modeled here perfectly by Ember, is a non-binary character portrayed by real-life non-binary actor Vico Ortiz. And these costumes allow mother and child to both engage and validate Ember's journey. Moving into Chapter 3, I'll say that for me personally, this was the point of the book that I wanted to write. This is what kicked off the whole project, the whole storyline. As I mentioned, when I attended cons with my daughters, I was impressed by the diversity and inclusivity I encountered at Comic Cons. And in this chapter, I wanted to address the way cosplay could empower individuals, regardless of factors like age, gender, sexual orientation, race, level of ability, disability, and so on. I mean, of course, there are still haters out there, especially when purists think you've transgressed against the canon. This is felt most heavily by cosplayers of color, largely due to the lack of resource material in popular culture. And I digress for a moment and point out that this is very much kind of a Western US problem. Since my interviews mostly come from the US, questions like, is it okay to have a black Batman, really seem to matter to some people. And here's where the international portion of the appendix comes into play. For example, at a Japanese con, it's not a problem if there is a Japanese Superman or Captain America or Luke Skywalker. And it's okay because 99% of the characters are a Japanese something. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't some narrow-minded perspectives, but again, this focus on who can dress as what really becomes a bit of a westernized issue. Returning both to the West and returning back to Liptak, we see his statement that cosplayers of color are often forced into an uncomfortable space. one where they are confined to either a limited number of characters who look like them or stepping outside their racial group and into a different one, tasked with reimagining the character at the same time. Kirkpatrick laments that for people of color to traverse racial boundaries by cosplaying as white characters is to traverse literature and media that seeks to make us invisible. Honestly, while we kept our eyes open, we did not encounter any radical departures or problems along race lines. What we saw more of was costumes used as a representation of gender. Returning to Nichols, we hear that cosplay offers a unique opportunity to explore and present appearances that may or may not conform to the participant's birth-assigned gender or to the original or canonical gender of the characters in television, movies, and video games. There's a large latitude of flexibility, particularly with crossplay or gender swapping. We saw that male to female crossplay is more rare and most often done for humorous effect, whereas female to male crossplay, such as Carlene here dressed as Captain America, seems to be more prevalent and generally a little bit more serious. For example, as Tompkins states, and these are her words, not mine, she says there is the cultural assumption that women are moving up the gender hierarchy. Now, beyond just gender-bending costumes, cosplay provides a fertile field where individuals can explore aspects of their own gendered selves. Again, back to Liptak, he said that cosplay can be a conduit for fans to explore their gender identity or operate under another name, and it provides a relatively safe environment for them to experiment with those depictions. As he concludes, it is an environment in which changing one's appearance is the norm. Continuing on with chapter 3, that chapter also addresses other demographic and identity issues such as age, body size, religion, and disabilities. In general, I noticed that cons are really embracing a cos-positive movement, supporting all participants, and that was reflected in the people that we spoke with. We met people like Rowan, a Muslim woman who needs to find ways to integrate her hijab into her costume, and she wants to serve as a role model for others. Or Ace, who makes their cosplay choices based on how they feel about the character and not whether that character is confined to a wheelchair. Or Angel, who suffers from ocular albinism and attended the Colorado School for the Blind and Deaf. Now, normally she would have her cane and someone to guide her through the crowd, but due to a minor leg injury, her friends were helping her navigate using a wheelchair. Now, of these three, Ace reported some degree of harassment on social media, but fortunately, none of them ever experienced any negativity or problems at live events. The three costume conversations for this chapter begin with Gracie, a South Dakota cosplayer who looks at costumes through the lenses of gender as a female, sexual orientation as a lesbian, as a parent, she's the mother of 4, and of race as a Filipino, though she told me she's the whitest Filipino you'll ever see. Here she is dressed as the male bard Jaskier from the TV series The Witcher. She quite often dresses as male characters because she participates as a drag king. Now, whereas a drag queen is a male entertainer that dresses up like a female, a drag king is a female entertainer who dresses up as a male. Next, we meet Jonathan, a professor from New York, who used cosplay as the first foray on a journey towards self-identification as non-binary. Here they are shown wearing a Star Trek scant, non-binary bunny communicator pin, black pleather pants, and gold go-go boots. They now want to serve as an ambassador for non-binary youth, knowing that this validation could lead to reduced negative self-talk and suicide. And in perhaps one of my favorite stories, we meet Samantha. Sam suffers from Holt-Oram syndrome. In addition to having a heart disorder, her arms are abnormally short. Her costume here is of Deadpool, a Marvel Comics hero who regenerates. And if you've seen the movies, you know it's done to comic effect. Ryan Reynolds gets his legs blown off, and then the audience laughs by watching him walk around on little baby legs. Now, if you notice on Sam's costume, she's wearing a pair of severed arms at her waist giving the impression that her arms were cut off and that they're now growing back out of her shoulders. Now, she always gets a really positive response when she wears this, and told me from the first time, I kind of felt like I fit somewhere in a way I'd never felt I fit anywhere else. All right, as we leave Sam's story behind, we also leave behind the cosplay half of the book and start to move into and beyond. Chapter 4 looks at costumes used to make or support a living. Now, it's important to note these are not uniforms like football jerseys or military apparel or Best Buy shirts, because those are, like the word says, uniform, and it doesn't have that conscious choice element that I'm looking for in costumes. In addition to looking at professional cosplay, I also looked at buskers, people who entertain in public places. The buskers we met with were the costume folks posing for pictures and accepting tips. We met them in New York City, on Times Square. We met them on Hollywood Boulevard, outside Grauman's Chinese Palace. And we met them on the Santa Monica Pier, singing and dancing and accessorizing to a responsive crowd. Now, in this last half of the book, there wasn't nearly as much research done or literature available for me to tap into, which gave me more space in the chapters to provide what I called spotlight stories. So they weren't as long as the costume conversations at the end of the chapter, but it still allowed me to provide more detail than just a quotation or two. And in chapter 4, the individual you see pictured here was the spotlight story. This is Lenny Hoops. In addition to the white tux, he has props for singing James Brown's Living in America, pictured here, plus various hats, capes, and glasses for songs from the likes of Ray Charles and Prince. You have to come out here looking like an entertainer, he said. You can't come out in your jeans and tennis shoes. You wouldn't go see Diana Ross if she was just wearing her regular old shit at the concert. Go Lenny. This chapter concludes with a discussion on historical reenactments. Chukla states that historical costumes enable their wearers and beholders to travel in time, to imagine or inhabit the past. And Fudumova concludes that historical reenactment is an effective tool for studying the material and spiritual evolution of mankind. Now, the costume conversations for chapter 4 include David Blevins. David is a drag queen named Cristal, who also dresses, as depicted here, as a flamboyant professional wrestler named Remy D. David wants to be a role model. He says, I love being inspirational and motivating people because I never had that as a younger kid living in Detroit. So I try to make myself bound to do that, due diligence to do that. Representing historical reenactments is John Luzander, a historian who travels the country and consults for national monuments and events. And he is adamant that costumes be historically accurate, right down to the stitching around buttonholes. Inaccuracies, as many of you may know, are called farbs, and they are to be avoided at all costs. Here he is as real-life character Patrick Gass, a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition who mapped out the western United States from 1804 to 06. Now, fortunately, Gass lived to a ripe old age. John has actually had to stop portraying some of his favorite roles because he got too old to realistically be seen as the character. Now, in contrast, we have Andy Mosher, director of an acting troupe called Deadwood Alive. He and his cohorts do daily Western shootouts on Main Street in the town of Deadwood, South Dakota. And while the stories they tell are true, mostly, like the shooting death of Old West icon Wild Bill Hickok, accuracy is not quite as important. We go by the 10-foot rule, he told me. If your costume looks good from 10 feet, then it's all right. From there, we move to chapter 5, which transitions to less about making a living and more about costumes as just a part of a lifestyle. The chapter begins with a focus on fashion, fabrics, colors, used to create an effect. It's not surprising that the word fashion comes from the same Latin root as the word fetish, or getting pleasure from images that are visually satisfying. And now in the lifestyle stories, there may be payments or stipends, but it's mostly about the experience, like members of the Society for Creative Anachronism who attempt to recreate feudal Europe, complete with kings and queens and battling knights in shining armor. Or similarly, the people you see at the summer Renaissance festivals in the US who range from road rennies or employees to platrons or the patrons who also dress up, oftentimes in more expensive and elaborate costumes than the people who actually work there. This chapter's additional spotlight story is of Rob and Kyla, who have day jobs, but they travel when they can to various cons with their photo booth. In this one, showing me in the center, they are dressed as characters from the Rocky Horror Picture Show, though they also do Beetlejuice, Ghostbusters, and the Addams Family. And they told me they reason that if carnies are people who work at carnivals, then because they work at conventions, they should be known as connies. Chapter 5 concludes with some topics you might expect in a book on costume, like drag and burlesque, but some topics that you might not expect, like tattoo culture and nudism. Now, this latter topic was in response to Back's statement that clothing occupies a special place as a manner of communication which is closest, metaphorically and literally, to the self. It covers what is to be private and shows the world the presentation a person wants to make. And I thought, well, if one's identity can be so intertwined with the clothing items that they put on, can your identity also intertwine with the clothing items you take off? Thus, we spent a day at Mountain Air Ranch, a nudist resort south of Denver, and discovered that the importance of expressing one's true self with clothing or without was almost identical. Now, the first costume conversation from chapter 5 is Michael, a high school teacher who occasionally does community theater, but most often just dresses for whatever holiday happens to come around. He teaches his students that what you wear has a lot to do with perception, and that perception does matter. He tells them, everybody says, I don't care what other people think. I argue that you should. If you don't care what other people think, how are you going to impact them? The lifestyle conversation I think that touched me the most was of Angel Cardon, a pinup model who uses the stage name Dottie Lucille. For her, this is more than just a character for photo shoots and parties. Following surgery complications, Angel contracted alopecia. She only has a few strands of gray and white hair. Her eyebrows and eyelashes have not returned. It has also created discolorations in her skin. So her response is she gets up 2 hours before everyone else at her house, putting on false eyelashes, drawing in eyebrows, adding foundation, powder, setting spray, lipstick, selecting and properly setting the correct wig, and then she adds the appropriate dress, heels, and accessories. And she does this every day, even if it's just to take her boys to school. And the final conversation for this chapter comes from the Mountain Air Ranch nudist resort. Okay, not surprisingly, interviews were okay, but I was not allowed to take pictures. Individuals could, however, send me selfies, such as this one of Erin and her boyfriend, Jesus. Prior to finding the resort, Erin had an eating disorder, which has since vanished. I came here and it was all forgotten, said Erin, all of it. Jesus, who also dropped out of therapy once joining the ranch, agrees, saying, if you've ever had a conflict with self-esteem, if you've ever felt judged, if you had to resort to a vice to escape how you felt about yourself, spend a weekend at a nudist ranch. It's frickin' heaven. All right, on those words, we move to the 6th and final chapter of the book, where I attempt to pull it all together. Now, rules are provided for research and participation. A heart-wrenching spotlight story is shared of a woman named Samantha, who credits cosplay with saving her life following years of cancer treatment and a radical mastectomy. I was actually scheduled to meet with Samantha to be one of the costume conversations in Chicago, but she was under the weather that day. But she did write up her story and gave me permission to share it with everyone. A special section then is included for parents, letting them know that if they don't understand what their teen is getting involved with, this is a happy and healthy activity. And I'm plant the seed that the family that cosplays together stays together. But the big lesson that I want people to take from this book when it comes to costumes is that anybody can be and dress as whatever they want. I mean, obviously there are warnings about cultural sensitivity. We are coming up on Halloween, and we are going to start to see the memes, the "my culture is not your costume" memes on social media. And I get it. I completely understand that. You can dress as whoever you want, but it's still important to be aware of systemic inequities and avoid costumes that ignore such power differences. I mean, the characters may be fictional, but history is not. For example, it just would not be good form for a Caucasian cosplayer to dress as the African hero Black Panther. It would be way worse if they did it in blackface. But as for other issues, age and biological sex or body shape, or whether or not your chosen character is from popular media or some obscure book that only you have read, it's fine. It's your costume. You have to be ready for backlash if you don't fit the canon, but if you're not hurting anybody, it's probably okay. I have a separate section in this final chapter that I call appropriate or appropriation. Costumees need to start with the question, am I doing this out of respect and admiration for a culture, or am I perpetuating a stereotype? Of all the photos I took for the book, to me, this one is probably the most important. 3 Muslim women from Indonesia are wearing rental kimonos and posing for a picture outside a temple in Tokyo. So I asked my wife, who is Japanese, if she was okay with this characterization. And she said, absolutely. They're learning about her culture. They are treating it with respect. They're having an enjoyable time. Okay, I asked, well, what if the person in the rental kimono was doing like a sexy geisha thing, that they hiked up the kimono to reveal fishnet stockings and stiletto heels outside of the temple? I mean, obviously that's not okay, right? Again, appropriate or appropriation. The costume conversations for this last chapter, I picked those individuals that I felt had best found the balance between work and costume life, who have faced their challenges and come out stronger on the other side, and who've concluded that you can be caring and creative at the same time. Let's start with the Bond family, better known as the High Plains Ghostbusters. Founding member Ches Jr., on the left there, is with his sister Mandy and his dad, Ches Sr. The family volunteers at multiple events, does birthday parties, drive-by greetings, and partners with other tribute groups for professional gatherings. And Dad, who lost his leg in a motorcycle accident, likes to share that he has a prosthetic leg decorated with the Van Gogh-inspired bat signal Starry Night, thus showing that you can turn something tragic into a positive thing. Positivity is also the trademark for Rachel Talby, a holistic life coach who uses her closet full of costumes to portray roughly 40 different characters at a variety of events and venues, ranging from children's birthday parties to singing telegrams. This costume here is Terra Thesaurus, a dinosaur who loves books. Rachel is also Countess Cora, who happens, you may have noticed, to be the cover of the book. Cora is the dark persona that allows her to do the shadow work, the introspection needed to understand who she is and how she chooses to reveal that to the world. And the final costume conversation is Greeley, Colorado's own Elvis tribute artist named George Gray. Ironically, George did not like portraying Elvis in his early days. It embarrassed him to the bone. Time does not permit me to share his entire story, but it involves a little old lady in hospice named Edie, who helped him understand that what he did was a gift to others. And he continues to share that gift and make a difference through endless visits to elder care facilities, sold-out Christmas shows, and numerous other volunteer and fundraising events. And that's essentially the book. Now, before we go on to your choices about the costume conversations and who we're going to explore in greater detail, I did promise to close with some suggestions, especially for those of you who are in academia or write for magazines or blogs or do broadcasts or want to write a book or shoot a documentary. First, as I mentioned, I suggest you strive to have a seamless integration between your personal and professional selves. I mean, yes, keep your work and personal life separate, but don't make them so discrete that you have to put on a completely different persona as you move back and forth between the roles. I mean, study, publish, and film what you are passionate about. Instead of trying to make the strange familiar, work to make the familiar strange so you can investigate and learn more about that which you'd be doing anyway. Next, and this is a personal bias on my part, keep the focus on people's stories. Everybody has a story, and everybody's story is important. Unfortunately, for every person I interviewed here, there are literally thousands of other costume people at cons and festivals and celebrations worldwide that I didn't meet. And of course, it's impossible to capture them all, but that shouldn't stop us from trying. And finally, don't feel you have to do it alone. Sometimes our professional engagements make us disengage from others. Writing a book or a dissertation or a journal article or editing a film, it can be a lonely thing. You need to accept help from others. I could not have done this project without the ongoing help of my wife, Maki. I've got a chronic fatigue disorder, and in addition to chronicling my interviews in these pictures, she did a lion's share of the driving, took charge of the photo release forms and the paperwork, carried a mirror to help people primp, and hugged those people when my questions made them cry. I mean, people often say I couldn't have done this without so-and-so, and it seems like an empty platitude. When I say that I could not have done this book without Maki, truer words were never spoken. And that wraps up my tour of the book. You know, I opened with Letta Mendy's comment that people feel more like themselves in costumes and that this is a natural process. If this topic is new to you, and it probably isn't to most of you out there in the viewing audience, but I hope that you learned a little bit, or at least enjoyed some human interest stories. And if this research is helpful to anyone personally, in terms of validating yourself and your experiences, then it makes the effort all worth it. Right, we're going to unpack again a few stories here, but before we do that, I just want to conclude by saying that I hope all your stories are positive ones, and I appreciate you being here today. So at this point, I'm going to ask for some help from the moderators and see who might have come to the top of the list as someone that we should look at in greater detail.
All right, I am launching the poll, and it is up. And please pick 3. If you feel really compelled to do a 4th one, go ahead, but please pick 3. All right, anyone else hasn't voted yet? You have 80% of people participating. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now, and I'm going to share the results.
Our flag means death. Looks like number 1.
All right.
Looks like Samantha, Lady Deadpool, is number 2.
All right.
Looks like Cat and Lee, Star Trek, is number 3.
All right, let's do that. Well, since I have, not knowing who was going to come up, I have the pictures. So if you could close that poll screen, okay. I'll go through and do these in order of where they show up. So we have Cat and Lee and Elaine and Ember and Samantha. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing their one-page story. So married couple Kathleen, Kat Sawyer, and Lee Montgomery are proud members of Starfleet International, the world's oldest Star Trek fan association. Kat and Lee's chapter is called the USS Tiburon. Lee is currently Chief Operations Officer. He keeps track of records and participation points. Kat is the chapter's counselor. My job is to take care of the ensigns, the under 18 kids that join. The chapter does a lot of philanthropic work. One of the biggest projects is Tribbles for Charity. The group makes the iconic furballs from the original series and adopt them out for a select charity each year. Kat enjoys dressing as characters from alien races, including a cat-like species known as Kitane from fan lore and the animated series, and a Trill, a humanoid species with spots on their face. Lee is most often a Starfleet officer, though he has been known to dress as a Klingon and a Ferengi, a scheming and highly capitalistic race known for their large foreheads and huge rounded ears. Now, when they met, Kat suffered from crippling social anxiety, which impacted most facets of her life. She was hoping to meet someone to help pull her from her shell. Lee had just gotten out of a long relationship and joined a few dating apps. Initially, there was no response, and he considered dropping the app when suddenly he received an extremely long message. Kat laughed. It was a 5-page email. If you know me, that's very short. From there, the message exchange began. We're texting back and forth, recalls Lee, and I think that conversation lasted for 5 hours. And it's all because I shared one picture and she saw me dressed as a Ferengi. I just sent him an email, Kat said, that said how much Star Trek has meant to me and my life. My dad and I used to watch Star Trek together. Uhura and Troy and Crusher and Seven of Nine. All these women were strong, independent women. They were beautiful and they could still kick your ass. I learned to be who I am and who I wanted to be through these women. And that was part of what I wrote to him in the email. Star Trek has always been a big thing in my life. I basically told him, hey, I want to meet the man who was brave enough to dress as a Ferengi. Lee laughs and adds, I'll be honest, I don't know if that was bravery or stupidity. And then Kat exclaims, we had a chance to go to a Comic-Con. They volunteered to help one of the guests run his booth. Because they were in costume, many assumed they were in charge. Now, things went great for Kat until their shift was over. She was supposed to change into her street clothes and meet Lee back at the booth. She describes what happened next. Well, if you've ever been to a convention, you know it's really hard to find where you need to be. I'm in a t-shirt and a pair of pants and trying to figure out how to get back to where I need to be. And there's just so many people coming and going. I had an anxiety attack. I backed myself into a corner just to breathe. And then it fully clicked in my head that when I was in my uniform, I could walk around that convention because it wasn't me. I had a force field. I had my shields up. Without the costume, I didn't have my shield up. Now, things have improved greatly for Kat since that episode, not only conventions, but for daily activities and her work as a manager and a bartender. I would have never been able to do that, what I do for work now, if it wasn't for the fact that cosplay helps. Even my work uniform is a form of cosplay. I put on my black polo and I put on my gray bartender skirt, and I'm not Kat, Lee's wife, the Kat's mommy, Bill's daughter. I'm assistant manager Kat. Just changing your clothes helps. It helps being in costume. The moral of the story is clear. Out of uniform, she feels vulnerable. In uniform, if you'll forgive the cheeky paraphrase, she and Lee boldly go where they've never gone before. And again, if you had a copy of the book, there would be pages and pages more than that. I just tried to hit a couple of highlights. So from there, we are moving on to Elaine and Ember. Here we go. The HBO Max comedy series, Our Flag Means Death, tells the story of real-life British aristocrat Stede Bonnet, who in the early 1700s walked away from his wealth to become a gentleman pirate. During his often ill-fated journey, he meets and falls in love with the notorious Blackbeard the pirate. In one touching scene, the two men are separated by fate. Broken-hearted, Blackbeard shaves off his namesake facial hair, puts on Stede's pink floral bathrobe, and gives way to his feelings. Among Bonnet's crew is a fake bearded but deadly pirate known only as Jim. Played by real-life non-binary actor Vico Ortiz, one episode reveals that Jim, identified as female at birth, is gender fluid. To their relief, the fellow pirates don't seem to care. It is against this backdrop that we meet Elaine Waterman and her non-binary teen Ember. With Elaine in floral robe and beard free, and Ember a dead ringer for Jim, the pirate story is a great cosplay scenario which allows this articulate mother and her child to explore and celebrate Ember's journey. Such a creative approach to understanding life through art is all in a day's work for Elaine. She is the executive director of the Firehouse Art Center in Longmont, Colorado, and a professional artist in her own right. Her first Comic-Con was in Denver. She says, I was on Facebook and found out they were doing a Marvel photo shoot. Ember dressed up as Captain America, and I dressed up as Black Widow. Now, these were completely store-bought costumes. We just wanted to go and have fun. After that, they began to make the Denver Con a regular outing. Early costumes had her as Marceline from Marceline the Vampire Queen, Cartoon Network, while Ember was Marceline's human friend, Finn. Later, Ember was a pea shooter from the Plants vs. Zombies video game, while Elaine, fittingly, was a zombie. Her favorite costume created for Ember was Drift from Fortnite. The favorite for herself? As far as mine, probably Yoshimitsu from Soul Calibur. That was the samurai warrior with the skull face. That one was pretty elaborate. With this background established, I moved deeper with the questions. I was most interested in how dressing up in costumes makes her feel. I really love that you get to inhabit a different kind of persona while bringing parts of your own personality into it. That led me to wonder whether or not she views costumes as an alternative personality, someone you are not, or are they instead an extension of your existing self? Well, when I cosplay Marceline, a lot of it is that you love the character. But what do you love about the character? It involves aspects of their personality that you wish you could bring into your own life. I guess psychologically, these people that you're playing, their strongest characteristics are probably something that you want to emulate in your life that you don't get a chance to. I definitely can see that it's getting to do something that you're not able to do, but I really feel that it picks up on stuff that's already inside you. We turn to examine the current pink floral robe. Obviously, Blackbeard's storyline character is male. Is she playing it literal, or is she giving an interpretation of a female Blackbeard? No, I don't play female versions of the character. If I want to do accurate cosplay, I will crossplay and be that person, how they express their gender identity. Elaine has thought the issue through and provides an insightful conclusion to the interview. In Our Flag Means Death, I feel like the outfits they use are really very thoughtfully chosen. As far as costume and identity, your clothing allows you to express who you are. Whether that's a gender identity or just self-expression, I think it's a really important link. Just like you can change your clothing, it gives you a stronger connection to who you are. That, it seems, is a fantastic point to wrap this up. Elaine says changing your clothing and changing your costume doesn't mean you're changing yourself. It just gives you a better understanding of who you are. All right, the next request was Samantha. And you'll notice I've got an extra picture of here. Sam actually had a couple of costumes for us. The first was her version of Lady Deadpool. And then she changed, and my wife and mom, her mom and my wife helped her change into this second costume, which is her version of a female Loki. With her story, the first time I encountered Sam, she was rushing past me at a con. Dressed as Wonder Woman, complete with sparkly bustier, her costume emphasized the fact that her arms were not fully developed. Her aura was one of confidence and class, with no sign of discomfort that she is differently abled, and I knew I had to interview her for this project. Sam has Holt-Oram syndrome, more commonly referred to as heart-hand syndrome, a rare disorder occurring in less than 1 in 100,000 births. Sam was frequently left feeling alone with her health issues in a world not designed to assist with her needs. There are accommodations that I use in the bathroom that are not common in the United States, she said. I only recently found out that bidets are a lifesaver for me. The reality is that most of the rest of the world washes with water, but they're not common over here, and I had no idea how much that would be helpful and useful to me, how much pain and trauma that would have saved me as a little kid growing up. These impediments, however, have not stopped Sam from striving to her full potential. Now in graduate school, she has a focus on archaeology. She spent 2 years in the UK and was able to work on a dig in Salisbury Plain, home to Stonehenge. The work that I've most enjoyed is working as an archaeology technician with the Forest Service. Sam hopes to work with the Forest Service again, but currently is in her second favorite job, working for the Denver Art Museum. Not only does she love being around museums and art, but she is also an artist herself. I've painted and drawn my entire life, she tells me. What I like to create when I do original work tends to be surrealist drawings or paintings. I started and still maintain a portfolio on deviantart.com, and I occasionally remember to post things on Instagram. At this time, her primary costumes are the two that she brought along, Lady Loki and Lady Deadpool. They are the costumes that most align with her identity as a person with a disability. Lady Loki, she reminds me, is simply Loki. Loki's character is gender fluid, both in the comics and the historical mythologies. And they're a shapeshifter, so having short arms shouldn't be an issue. The character could conceivably have short arms. She also likes the shifting Loki persona because a few years ago, her father came out as transgender. And that's part of the appeal of Loki, she said. The character is gender fluid and the Norse god is gender fluid, and I think that's huge for anybody with a different gender identity. As for Lady Deadpool, her reasoning is equally convincing. It's easier to fit the canon of a character like Deadpool, who regenerates, when you have anatomically different features, like in my case, shorter arms. And as I mentioned earlier, please notice in the full color photo of Sam as Lady Deadpool, she's wearing a pair of severed arms at her waist. Thus, you are given the distinct impression that her arms are now regenerating back out of her shoulders. She says, the Deadpool characters represent disability in a very unique way. They are disabled with the ability to be fully capable. You are presenting that full capability and disability at the same time. For me, I guess it's like being perceived and accepted in that way. It's kind of a win when that happens. Sam pauses after this sentence and then adds the most moving words that I heard in any of my interviews. I kind of felt like I fit somewhere, in a way I'd never felt like I fit anywhere else. Before I leave Sam for the day, I ask about the Wonder Woman outfit I first saw her in. Unlike the ladies Loki and Deadpool, the character does not shapeshift or regenerate. With a wry smile, she says, female empowerment. I'm not just a disabled person, I'm a woman. As a woman, how can you not cosplay Wonder Woman? It makes you feel powerful. When it comes to costume and identity, Sam has it figured out. You know, if y'all don't mind, I noticed there was a tie between Cat and Lee and Hospital Batman, and I think we've got time. I would like to share his story before we go out to the Q&A. So here we go with Casey Barrett, aka Hospital Batman. Casey is the father of two, a 16-year-old high-functioning autistic son and a 10-year-old wheelchair-bound daughter with a genetic disorder that leaves her functioning like a 1-month-old. Casey, a licensed CNA, is her caretaker. His third child, sadly, passed away in 2010. Because of these health challenges, Casey labels his family as frequent flyers to Children's Hospital. Over the years, he recalls many occasions where the hospital had special visitors. One of the more impactful moments occurred when his daughter was hospitalized for influenza. We took our son to the hospital to see his sister. He kind of had a meltdown in the lobby. Now, that particular day, Captain Jack Sparrow walked into the lobby. For my son, it completely flipped his day around. He forgot that his sister was upstairs, forgot we were in the lobby of a hospital. I mean, that was a relief for him, but also for me. A year later, Casey saw a Batman Dark Knight costume for around $300. Remembering the Jack Sparrow incident, Casey reached out to the director of volunteers for a local hospital and asked how to get involved. He was ready to begin. Coincidentally, the day I got the suit, my daughter had to go for an overnight EEG study, so I took it with me. Her nurse told me to get dressed in it, so my daughter was actually my first visit. He literally beamed as he shared this. It was just amazing. He followed that with an equally amazing lobby visit where he was hooked. One thing I wanted to make sure to do is that I was always volunteering, he continued. I was never going to take money for it. I didn't want to do birthday parties. At the hospital, none of the kids are there for a good reason. As someone myself who also dresses as a Batman version for community events, I wanted to talk a little bit about the character. Well, Batman is unique, reflected Casey. He's got iconic levels at every generation. You put that cowl on and, you know, it's not a shutdown, but you hit a level that you just kind of stay at, and that's where you live. I mean, I'm not an actor. I've never tried to be an actor. When I'm in a cowl, you can see these children that are suffering or going through stuff, and nobody can see. Casey pauses because it's hard not to react. We did an event where it was a conference for parents of children who were burn victims. So one conference room was for the parents, and the next room was superheroes hanging out with the kids. And it's heartbreaking, but they don't ever get to see my face react to that heartbreak. Now, just as one cannot see Casey's face, there is another aspect to this persona that he keeps hidden. Like his comic character namesake, Casey has a secret. He remembers the Captain Jack Sparrow incident and what it meant for him personally, having a moment for himself. For me, it's like 60% for the kids, but 40% is for the parents. The parents also forget in that moment that their kid is lying in a hospital bed. Even if it's just for 30 seconds, that stress and that worry is just gone for that brief moment. That is Casey's motivation. Moments. He shares a recent moment with a young boy with cancer who'd been given weeks to months to live. Casey had planned to be at the boy's upcoming birthday party, but felt compelled to attend a neighborhood candlelight vigil held 2 weeks before. The mom went inside and told him that Batman was there, and he said, "Well, I'm a superhero too." "Yeah, more than anybody out there." The boy died the day before his birthday. Casey shakes his head. "The doctor told him he had weeks. Maybe we could hold off to the birthday." "I'm so glad we didn't." My final question for Casey was a tough one. I asked him if doing this helped him with his own grief. To a degree. There's a part of you that doesn't heal, and I don't think ever will. I don't know if it's healing, but what I do, it's reassuring. There's a positive contribution, and that gets me through, and I think that's kind of enough. All right. At that point, I'm going to stop my share and look at some of the questions that people have.
There are questions turning up in the chat. And
Okay.
one of them was your research impacted by the pandemic?
Not a whole lot because it kicked off in 2021. So things with the pandemic were starting to calm down. There were a couple of interviews where there were health questions and my wife and I wore masks, but it really didn't come into play a lot. Now, when we were in Japan, it was almost as if the pandemic was still in full swing. In Japan, a lot of people, even in non-pandemic eras, wear masks. And so everybody was wearing masks everywhere.
Someone wants to know, what are your thoughts on portraying evil characters in cosplay?
Great question. I actually have a section in the book. I went to a panel at a con, and it was about do's and don'ts for costume characters. And I thought it was going to be more do's and don'ts for either how to treat costume characters. I thought it was going to maybe be on bullying or something like that. But actually, it was do's and don'ts for people when you are in costume. And a lot of it dealt with what happens when you are dressed as the villain, what happens when you're dressed as an evil person. And the feeling was, well, you want to, yes, convey that persona. You want to try to, be the character, but you don't take it out on your audience. You don't actually go and terrorize them. I forget the name of the author. He actually wrote a book on costume construction, but he had a whole section on, don't let the villain take over. Don't use your costume as an excuse to engage in bad behavior. So I guess that would be my take on it is, sure, you can look moody and malevolent and so on, but be careful not to be harmful, hurtful, excessively scary. Read the room.
There was a comment from one of the audience that recently on social media and the TV show Loki, also I think Star Trek, popularizing the concept of variants from other timelines. How do you feel about that in working for cosplayers that are from a different gender or a different ethnic background. Does that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, I've got a section in the book that only goes so far in talking about the whole multiple universe theory. I give examples from Spider-Man, the Return Home one, and from Doctor Strange, and the whole Madness universe thing, and Ant-Man and the Wasp, the Quantum Mania, and the Loki TV show. And by the time the book was published, those were really the only sort of multiverse ones that had come out. I knew when I wrote it that the Flash movie was going to come out and really also deal with this multiverse kind of thing. And basically conclude in all of these universes out there, you better believe there's going to be a black Batman. And there's going to be, well, we know that there is a Captain Britain, a female version of Captain America. There is a kind of a meme or a thought out there, I believe it's called Rule 63, that for every character that exists, there is a universe out there for which they are gender swapped. So I really think the multiple universe theory is a great way to do it. In fact, when I go to cons as Ego, the living planet, obviously there's a lot of Star-Lords that don't like me, because in our universe viewing, Ego is kind of a bad dude, and they have to end up killing him. And so I try to explain to everybody, no, I'm the good Ego, the one who didn't plant a brain tumor in Star-Lord's mom's head, and go with that, because I want to be a nice guy.
Do you know whether most of your interviewees bought or made their costumes? And did you perceive a difference between maker cosplayers and persona cosplayers?
You know, I really did not see a difference. It was a mix of both. I mean, some are completely handmade. For example, all the people that do the Deadwood Alive show, they have to provide their own leather jackets and cowboy vests and cowboy hats and everything. They don't have a budget for it. And so everything is put together. And that's why they have that 10-foot rule. Whereas someone like Samantha, you know, she needs to buy her costumes. They need to be adapted a bit for her, but she's not really in a position to make. So she goes out and buys the pieces and puts them together. And I think I saw a combination of things. You know, Elaine's robe, for example, was handmade because she specifically wanted the exact fabric that they used in the TV show. And she found the fabric online, purchased it, and made the robe, but Ember's clothes were store-bought. It was kind of a mix. Some people seem to make a big deal out of that it's got to be handmade. But I think that really, in the cosplay world, only becomes relevant if you are competing. You know, if you are in a contest and it really, it matters, the craftsmanship and so on. Other than that, pretty much everybody I talked to said it doesn't really matter where you got your costume and whether you made it or not, just so you're out there having a good time.
Okay, got a comment here from someone. Jennifer says, Adam Savage said in a TED talk he gave on cosplay, costumes are how we reveal ourselves to each other. I feel your book has helped delve into this and how it differs from person to person. So.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I do think that's the message that I try to get across, is that this is an opportunity to test drive, you know, aspects of your personality. Does more to reveal than to conceal.
Can I offer you a technical question? Someone that Randall says, how do you do that presentation thing that lets us see you in front of your slideshow? It's really cool.
It is an option under share screen that I discovered this week. I was practicing at home to see how I needed to set up the lighting in my office, and it was honestly one of the buttons you could push.
There you go, Randall. Did you only go to large conventions, or were these like professional cons, fan run for cosplayers? What type of conventions were they?
A little bit of everything. So I went to a couple that were the fan expos, the big, huge conglomerate ones, but also some smaller boutique conferences like Anime Con. And the New York Comic Con, the Big Apple Comic Con, was really a very small kind of intimate affair in a hotel that maybe had hundreds of people. We have a local here in Colorado, the Fort Collins Comic Con, which again, more hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 people show up, not tens of thousands. So I tried to do a cross section.
I did have one question. Did you see any difference in the way people in the US, cosplayers in the US view cosplay versus, say, Japan?
Well, as I mentioned, canon seemed to matter a little more to people and matter in a way that was very unfortunate. While I didn't encounter it, I cite a few examples in my book, articles that I read that others had written about, for example, Black cosplayers doing anime characters that are Asian, or women who were heavier portraying characters that were smaller. And in social media, they're getting feedback. I mean, not just that they don't look the part, but that they're ugly and that they ought to kill themselves. I mean, that's just outrageous how some of the things on social media in the US, really got out of hand. And where, again, it's not a factor so much in Asian countries. What I encountered a lot there that is important is looking the part, creating the scene. Here we do the runway sorts of shows, or we do the costumes contest where people walk out on stage and maybe you do a little skit or something like that. And in Asian cultures, it's more walking on stage and freezing. And now I've forgotten the artistic name for it. There used to be a Last Supper show that took place out in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and the actors would walk around and suddenly they would freeze.
Tableau vivant.
There you go, right? That is more what you see in Asian cultures, that it's creating that look, creating that moment. And that's what's really important, is accuracy in that tableau.
Anne is asking, did you go to Costume Con when it was in Denver last April? Well, this April. It was April 2024.
No, I did not.
She's just curious.
So have you looked at costuming communities? Because the individual costumers you're talking about are individuals or pair costumers, but how costumers interact in a costuming community, like say the 501st, or any of the other ones that portray a particular genre, things like that. You looked at SCA, for example, and that was a costuming community.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have any ideas about the importance of the community over a long period of time plays out?
I do a little bit of comparison and contrast. I mean, one of the things that I look for are stories of us versus them. Who's the us and who's the them? And sometimes you find that distinction made a little bit more clearly, like the Society for Creative Anachronism. They really want people who are in their bubble to be very realistic, to look the part. When I asked if I could come take pictures, I actually took pictures at a baronial investiture ceremony. And I was asked to not enter the grounds while the event was going on. And I was allowed to stand outside of the grounds and use a telephoto lens and take some pictures of the ceremony. And I did wear kind of a tunic shirt. I wanted to, blend as much as absolutely possible. And then when the ceremony was done, they allowed me to come on the grounds, and they lined up for that big wide photo that you saw. So there are some storylines that have that kind of inclusivity. There are also storylines that expand outside of that and that were germane to kind of all the communities I talked to. And that, for example, is the cause positive movement. I heard that at the big cons. I heard that at the small cons. I heard that from the various people that I talked to in terms of trying to be tolerant, trying to show love, trying to be accepting of people. And it was interesting how that cause positive movement expanded out until it hit historical reenactment. And then that became a different kind of community because accuracy there was really paramount. The us versus them mattered more to that group.
I noticed a similar thing happening with Comic-Con in San Diego, for instance, where they'll have maybe 100 women dressed, and maybe some people who are cosplaying too, dressed as Princess Leia. And they have a Jabba the Hutt there, and they go for costume photos, and they sort of hang together as a community. And it's really interesting to see the difference among all the people doing that, all shapes and sizes and even genders, forming a community spontaneously around that costume.
Right. And like I said, that was what really attracted me to this, was the openness and the inclusivity, all ages, races, shapes, sizes, and everything really fitting in and finding a place. Very important.
Any final thoughts for us today?
I guess I will just reiterate the kind of points that I made, is always consider that question appropriate or appropriation. If you are representing some kind of a racial, cultural kind of community, are you doing so out of respect, or are you perpetuating a stereotype? And if it's done with openness, if it's done with tolerance, if it's done with love, it's probably going to be okay, and have a great time.
Right. Tom, I really want to thank you for your time today and for your really great presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I want to just thank you for coming and talking to us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen and talk about upcoming webinar. Our next webinar is laser cutters for costumers, and it's going to be with Taylor Pope, who's the Silicon Web Vice President as well, and a really amazing costumer. He's going to explain the benefits of laser cutters and costuming fabrication. He's going to introduce different types of laser cutters and how he used them in costuming construction. He does inflatable costumes, and so he makes heavy use of laser cutters, but he does other things as well. He's also going to talk about how to pick a laser cutter that's suited for your task and budget, and then how to make designs for cutting either at home or by sending them to laser cutter services, which I didn't know existed, but apparently they're out there as almost everything else. So this is on October 27th. This is starts at 2 o'clock rather than our traditional 1 o'clock, but please do come to that one. Christmas is coming up, and you may have a laser cutter on your Christmas wish list. Announcements of upcoming webinars are emailed to Silicon Web Costumers Guild and International Costumers Guild members. They're posted as events and notices on Facebook, so you can look for those. And they're also published in the Silicon Web Costumers Guild Virtual Costumer magazine. Information on upcoming webinars also appears on the calendar page of the Silicon Web Costumers Guild website, so you can always go look at what's coming up, and there'll be a summary there of each of the webinars that's coming up. Recordings of past webinars are also available, including this one, in a week or so, and we'll make an announcement on this webinars page of the Silicon Web Costumers Guild website. So feel free to go back and look at those. This is our 3rd season, so we have a lot of really interesting webinars that you can go back and look at. And we thank the speakers for giving us permission to record and make those webinars available on our YouTube channel. If you're interested in joining the Silicon Web Costumers Guild, information is available on the Join Us page of our website. So please feel free to look at that. And if you're so inclined, feel free to join us. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.